Cominciamo. Good afternoon, everybody. And first of all, sorry for my very bad English, but I try to speak in English because it's better for our host. This is I'm the Secretary General of the Chamber of Commerce of Torino, and I'm very glad to give you a warm welcome in the Congress Center of the Chamber of Commerce in this event that we organized together with Fondazione per l'Ambiente Teobaldo Fenoglio and International Solid Waste Association, and also Acea Pinerolese. First of all, a great thanks to all the partners for the timely organization of this seminar, characterized by the precious presence of international guests and local policymakers and experts. Today we speak about waste, and so our first reference must be the Waste Framework Directive of the European Commission. I think that the message that is conveyed by this directive is clear, but further steps are required both at European level and at Member States level in order to be able to implement it effectively at local level. Topics like end of waste principle are relevant to ensure that the paradigm of efficient use of research is present on policymakers and enterprises' agenda. As modern society, we must aim at a sustainable economic growth. The objective of increasing the environmental awareness of local stakeholders is in fact clearly stated in the strategic plan of the Chamber of Commerce of Torino. We in Italy, I try to explain to our foreign guests, in Italy, Chamber of Commerce are public bodies, so are part of the public administration of the country. The enterprise are obliged to pay every year a tax to the Chamber of Commerce. Every kind of enterprise, so from the small one-man shop to the big multinational company, are subscribed to the Chamber of Commerce. And we have to build every legislation, every time of government. For us, 5 years, the duration of our board. We have to build a strategic plan in which we explain how we will spend the research that comes from the enterprise. And so we have the strategic plan is very important to define the more important things to do in the 5 years program. And in our late strategic plan, the environment in general will save of energy in particular are an important issue for us. So this explains that because we are here today to open this seminar, and also we work with Fondazione during all the year on these themes. The focus this afternoon is on biowaste and in particular on the biological treatment of organic fraction of municipal solid waste. I wish that the public present here will leave a room later tonight with a clear idea on how to make the best use of it from an environmental and economic point of view. And at the same time, I wish that the policymakers present today will gain valuable information for their work. We believe that the approach chosen to investigate the matter is the correct one, and thanks to the active role of associations like International Solid Waste Association, the comparison between different experiences and studies in very different countries will be effective. I wish to thank Professor Genon, who will chair all the session, and who will coordinate the final roundtable with his great competence. And I wish to thank Professor Genon and the Fondazione, not only for the seminary, but also for all the works that we do during the years. I also wish to thank all the speakers who brought experience, will help to make this event particularly valuable. The agenda is very rich, so I wish you an interesting and fightful afternoon. Thank you and good work.
Grazie dottor Bolatto. Io credo che possiamo cominciare questa sessione non occupando altro spazio in preamboli, tutti sono al corrente del significato di questa iniziativa. Abbiamo una prima parte che è fatta di 5 presentazioni di tipo molto tecnico e una seconda parte che invece avrà un contenuto più gestionale amministrativo. Io penso che se questi 5 interventi si contenessero in 20 minuti ciascuno, possiamo lasciare un minimo spazio per eventuali domande o chiarimenti. Con questo darei la parola alla prima speaker, Jane Gilbert, che viene dall'Istituto Waste Management UK, che parlerà di linee evolutive del trattamento biologico alla luce degli sviluppi delle politiche EU di settore. Please.
Is that better? Yeah. Excellent. Okay. Buongiorno. Okay. It's nice to be welcomed here, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me to speak. And it's nice to be somewhere warm for a change, because it was only about 4 degrees Celsius when I left the UK this morning, so it's nice to be in some warmth. What I want to do is really just give you a bit of an overview, just try to introduce this whole session about some of the developments for biowaste treatment and biowaste policies across the EU. Really just set the scene before Enzo and other colleagues speak. So I'm just going to say a very little bit about biological treatment. I'm sure most of you all know what it's about, but it's just really just so we all know what we're talking about. Just to tell you a little bit about how European Union policies have developed over the last 10 years or so, and perhaps some of the things that need to be put in place if we're actually going to realise the potential that biowaste actually offers our societies. So firstly, very briefly, what is biological treatment? Well, it's made up of 3 basic processes: composting, anaerobic digestion, and mechanical biological treatment, MBT. There are a range of processes and technologies, and a lot of them are interrelated as well. It can treat biowaste and, importantly, manufacture products that have very valuable end uses. It can also stabilise wastes before disposal, and there's a range of different techniques, either in the absence or in the presence of oxygen. So all in, there's many benefits from actually biological treatment processes. So what is biowaste? Well, it was formally defined in the Waste Framework Directive, and it probably includes a lot of things that we think of here. Here's some in this picture here. I think this is Belgian biowaste, but I guess it's pretty much the same in Italy as it is in the UK and other member states. We've got garden and park wastes, food wastes, and food from food processing plants as well. But it does exclude agricultural wastes. And across the EU, there's an estimation of between 118 and 138 million tonnes produced every year. So very significant quantities, of which about 88 million tonnes is estimated to be municipal waste. So managing biowaste is clearly a very important thing to be doing. And in terms of policies coming from within the European Union, we've over about the last 11, 12 years, we've seen a number of initiatives. First of all, the first working document on biowaste, which was published in 2000, didn't really say a great deal, that first document, but it was followed quite quickly by a second working document in 2001, which really did actually get to grips with a lot of the issues about managing biowaste sustainably. And there was widespread stakeholder consensus and agreement across both member states, municipalities, and also stakeholder groups as well as to what was in that and some of the way forward. That second working document was then followed in 2004 by another discussion document, but dealing more with biowaste and sludges, and it had less impact. Then nothing really happened while the Commission was actually working on the Waste Framework Directive, and that was published in 2008. And within that, it actually called upon the Commission to assess biowaste management in the EU and propose measures to improve it if appropriate. So there's a clear lead within the Waste Framework Directive there. And that was followed very shortly by the Green Paper on Biowaste, which once again set out a lot of things that they would like to see, but not really how we would go about achieving them. And in May of last 2 years ago, the Commission produced a communication on biowaste. Now, this communication was quite important. On the one hand, it said separate collection and biological treatment was justified on economic and environmental grounds. But then, on the other hand, actually said, well, we prefer to enforce existing legislation, the Landfill Directive and the Waste Framework Directive. We want to look at improving biowaste prevention, and in particular, reducing the amount of food waste that's produced. And they also wanted to look at improved compost and digestate management and markets, so markets for the end materials and how these can be improved. So all these documents over the last 10, 11 years or so has meant that there's still a big difference in biological treatment capacity across the EU. In some of the Baltic states and some of the new member states, there's little national infrastructure. There's a few very good local examples, but not a great deal nationally. There's some member states, for example, Spain and Ireland, where there are some separate collection schemes and some quite good infrastructure, but only in places. And then there's some member states where there's established national composting and anaerobic digestion sectors, coupled with widespread separate collection schemes for biowaste as well. And within that, we've got Italy, we have Germany, Austria, and I think the UK has also joined that as well in recent years. But in terms of these big potential of biowaste out there, we're estimating there's probably only in the region of around about 35 million tonnes a year that's treated. And I think it's important that to note words that was actually published in a report for the European Commission in January of this year that actually said implementation of the Landfill Directive across member states was found to be impartial, due in part to varying performance on biowaste diversion. So biowaste diversion and treatment is obviously very key to meeting the landfill diversion targets. And I think you'll see this picture a little later on from one of my colleagues. But basically it just tries to show graphically the differences in a number of the different member states in terms of the infrastructure and the processing capacity that's in place. So why are some of the barriers? Why are these occurring in some member states and not others? Well, I think most of it comes down to, fundamentally, to a lack of strategic planning framework in many member states, where there's unclear legislative framework in place, especially at a municipal level. It does mean that there's not economies of scale that can't be realised in terms of managing to procure and finance infrastructure. And of course, a lack of targets does mean that it's difficult to secure capital finance, especially in the current economic climate as well. In many member states, there's a complex interplay between various parties, businesses, the private sector, the public sector, municipalities, individuals, and agriculture as well. So it's quite complicated in terms of managing to get these systems actually put in place. And I think importantly as well, in some member states, one issue that's been brought up is the ownership of landfills by some of the municipalities, and there's a real economic interest there for them to maintain the status quo. But just an example, and I'm going to use the UK here, and this is work that I've been involved in over the last 15 years, that when clear targets are set by national government, and recycling targets have been set for municipalities, coupled with clear restrictions on landfilling biodegradable municipal waste, plus a fiscal incentive through a landfill tax, which this year in the UK is at €67 a tonne. We've seen a very steep increase in the amount of biowaste treated. And the middle slide, the middle one there, with the light blue right at the very end, is for composting, where we have about 5 million tonnes of biowaste composted in the UK at the moment in 2009. So it just goes to show what clear targets and a clear message from government, coupled with financial incentives, can actually produce. So the potential across the EU, a recent report by the Biointelligence Service and published on behalf of the European Commission, they actually estimated that there could be an additional 80 million tonnes of biowaste treated in 2020 if there was better implementation of existing measures and a clear lead coming through from member states in terms of what should be achieved in meeting some of these targets. So that's a significant increase. So what we have at the moment, I've just tried to show this graphically, is that we have a lot of disjointed regulation and policies across Europe. And I'm just going to talk about a few of these. And there's further few more of these proposed in 2012. First of all, in terms of markets, we heard that markets are going to be so important for a viable biowaste treatment sector. And the 2008 Waste Framework Directive set out the position that end-of-waste criteria, so criteria when wastes have been treated such that they're not going to harm the environment or human health, can no longer be treated as waste. So, therefore, taking materials, compost and digestate out of waste regulation. I'm not going to say a great deal about it because a colleague, Joseph Barth, is going to talk about this a little bit later on. But that work is actually ongoing during 2012 when we're expecting a formal proposal from the Commission, and then the detail will be down to the comitology procedure to adopt the proposals. So that's one clear, very policy area that's actually going to affect the whole biowaste treatment sector across the EU. There's the fertiliser regulation. The current fertiliser regulation, 2003, covers inorganic mineral fertilisers only, and there's a realisation by the Commission that there are other organic fertilisers and other materials out there that have fertilising properties, and their wish is to include that within the fertiliser regulation. So that will include composts, it will include growing media, soil improvers. So they've initiated 4 working groups which met in January of this year in Brussels, with further meetings scheduled throughout the year. An impact assessment has been conducted, and this work is likely to set contaminant limit levels as well. So limit levels for contaminants going in. So on the one hand, we're going to see those for end-of-waste criteria, but we're also going to see them in the fertiliser regulation as well. Oops. We've also got the animal byproducts regulation. Nothing new. It was first introduced in 2002 in the wake of the foot-and-mouth disease and the problems with BSE, so-called mad cow disease. But it was revised in 2011. It's complicated, and I'm not even going to start to go into it in this. But needless to say, the ultimate impact is that where food waste and catering waste are involved, it impacts upon the design and operation of treatment plants, and there places some restrictions on the use of compost or digestate manufactured from Category 2 and Category 3 animal byproducts. And not least, the final one is the Industrial Emissions Directive. That came into force in 2010 and recast a number of different directives, including the IPPC directive. Within that, there's a requirement to have a best available technique reference document, a so-called BREF, for each industry sector, and the waste sector is one of those. But trying to identify a BREF that covers the whole of waste management is going to be nigh impossible. So the aim is that during this year, there will the Commission with the JRC will work on developing a mini BREF for biological waste treatment. So once again, this will set out best available techniques, so this might well impact upon the way in which plants are designed and operated. And I think it's unclear here what the impacts will be. They're probably going to be more clearly defined at a much larger scale, but when it comes to small decentralised systems, there's quite a bit of uncertainty there. So really, just to summarise all these different initiatives, there's some new legislation from Europe that requires implementation now. There's some new initiatives underway, in particular the end-of-waste criteria and the fertiliser regulation. And so really there's a complex series of initiatives that impact upon biowaste treatment and end use of the product in a number of different ways. So none of these on their own will actually set about improving biowaste treatment, I don't think, in my opinion. In March of last year, a report by the Commission on setting biowaste recycling targets concluded that there would be net benefits from setting targets. In January 2012, this report by the Biointelligence Service on implementing waste legislation for green growth estimated an extra 80 million tonnes in 2020 of biowaste that could be treated through better enforcement. And I think importantly, and this goes on to what my colleague Enzo Favoino is going to talk about in his next talk, that a report published by the Commission last month called for stronger measures to protect Europe's soils against degradation. And importantly, they actually say that large amounts of manure and biowaste are produced every year. They can improve soil conditions, and to ensure that we do that, we need to have proper collection, treatment, and end use of these wastes and residues. So once again, we've had something coming through from a soils point of view as well. So what's needed? Well, in my opinion, I think we do need to see much better integration of all these different initiatives. At the moment, all of the cogs on this wheel are disjointed. They're all being carried out separately. What we would really like to see are targets for biowaste recycling, and we've seen what happened in the UK when municipalities were set recycling targets. We need to see separate collection schemes to collect clean wastes for treatment. We need to have quality assured products that are manufactured so that end users have confidence that they're receiving and using a consistently produced material that is fit for purpose. And of course, we need to have markets for these products as well. What we're hoping to achieve is by moving down from this box here on the far left, where we're dealing with disposal of mixed wastes, to one where we're seeing much greater recycling and front-of-pipe treatment, so reducing contamination, keeping waste separate and dealing with them before they become mixed in with other materials. And I think really biowaste is moving in this direction in some member states and has moved into that bottom box in some member states, but not in others. So how are we going to achieve this? Well, I think a lot of us in the room would have liked to have seen over the last 10 years separate legislation on biowaste, and I don't think we can expect anything in the near future. The Commission has been very clear that they just wish to see better implementation of existing legislation, although with the new upcoming legislation coming in place, fertiliser regulation, end-of-waste criteria, that's going to be even more complicated to achieve. The Commission really wants to see a set of actions aimed at supporting existing targets in the Waste Framework Directive and supporting compost markets. Will they be effective? who knows? I think we're going to see some movement in some member states, but I think there's going to be others that are going to struggle. So hopefully I've given you a bit of an overview of what's happening within Europe, what's happened to biowaste over the last decade or so, and some of the things that are going to be having effect over the next 12 months or so. Thank you.
Grazie molte, credo che questo possa costituire un primo quadro in cui inserire le considerazioni che adesso verranno svolte sui diversi aspetti. Dare la parola al dottor Favoino, che presiede il working group sui trattamenti biologici di ISVA e che ha un'esperienza multiennale su questi argomenti.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. First of all, if I may, on a funny note, ladies and gentlemen, if you should consider it funny to have an Italian speaking in English to Italians, well, we know Italian is the language of the future. But since we are still living in the present, let me speak the language of the past. Apologies, Jane, for that, namely English today. No, that's the duty of hospitality towards the foreign guests whom I also want to thank for their commitment to this initiative, and let me praise the efforts by the local organizers in order to have this up and running. However, I happen to chair the Working Group on Biological Treatment and the International Solid Waste Association. You're warmly invited to consider joining the International Solid Waste Association and the activities of the Working Group on Biological Treatment. Certainly, it was not my personal merit to be appointed as the chair. Probably it's the acknowledgement of the, I would say, somewhat leading role that Italy has been covering on biowaste management in the last decades, in many instances, above all on the optimization of separate collection systems. And let me mention very briefly what the efforts done by the municipality of Turin. Probably Turin is one of the schemes for separate collection of biowaste covering the highest population across Europe, one of those certainly, and certainly the one in Italy with the highest population covered by the scheme. However, today my duty is to talk about the potential contribution of biowaste management to tackle climate change. We know that the political agenda has been populated in the last few years about talks and discussion on how to tackle climate change, how to reduce greenhouse gases. In this respect, unfortunately, biowaste has long been considered only as a potential renewable energy source, so only the energetic angle has been considered. But I'm here also to highlight, well, in this respect also, biowaste management may contribute because anaerobic digestion produces a fully renewable and carbon neutral, carbon beneficial, because we replace fossil fuels, energy. But there are also some neglected benefits of managing biowaste properly related to the soil-related benefits, which may translate into a reduction of greenhouse gases. Let's go stepwise in this respect. Well, we know that the decay of organic matter produces carbon dioxide, but this is considered carbon neutral because it's biogenic carbon. We know the use of compost may replace fertilizers, and it's quite easy to be accounted for because we may avoid the energy uptake of producing and applying fertilizers, mineral fertilizers, onto farmlands. But then we have got also something else. The use of compost may lock up some carbon in soil, and this goes under the name of carbon sequestration, and it's drawing attention by the policymakers. And anaerobic digestion produces some renewable energy, which is fully accountable as a replacement for fossil fuels. Therefore, a net benefit for the environment. This is just to give you in a snapshot the magnitude of potential benefits related of any such effects of managing biowaste. But this is still to be discussed because basically the backbone of my presentation will be that there is still a wide area for investigations in order to have better light on the potential benefits of reducing greenhouse gases through the production and use of compost. For instance, carbon sequestration, which is hardly, if ever, considered in life cycle analysis. This is mostly due to some methodological constraints, the so-called century model, according to which you may only consider carbon sequestered if it stays there for 100 years. But actually, even if the average lifetime of carbon in soil is 50 or 20 or 30 years, that's a benefit, because in time it will build up organic matter in the soil, we will have more carbon in the soil and less carbon in the atmosphere. We'll go back to these arguments. And then there are also the extended benefits which may translate into reduced greenhouse gases, such as a reduced release of nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is the most powerful contributor, greenhouse gas coming from the agricultural sector. It's 310 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. And so any marginal reduction in the production of nitrous oxide may be a huge effect in terms of tackling climate change. Improved workability, of course, translates into a lower energy uptake for plugging, tilling, any type of land farming. What are the limitations with life cycle analysis? The life cycle analysis, which are certainly the main tool used and are a very promising tool, but still are far from being complete vis-à-vis the potential effects of managing biowaste properly. Because normally they account for material replacement and not for the induced effects, such as the better workability, then driving to a lower energy uptake for work in the soil. Also, some effects of using compost on soils actually are hard to be accounted for, but nevertheless they are important. The magnitude is what matters, even though there is some uncertainty tightly related to it. And I will go back to this argument and draw your attention to it. Because certainly improved workability, better water retention, carbon sequestration are very much dependent on the type of soil, the climatic conditions, the cropping technique, and so on and so forth. So those are very site-specific conditions, but nevertheless they are important. And so we should make some efforts in order to have such arguments embedded in policy making related to biowaste. Well, as I told you already, the replacement of chemical fertilizers is the most easy to be calculated and taken into account. You can see here, this is the curve of release of nitrogen in different years after you use a soil improver with a certain amount of nitrogen. On the average, you may consider 2% nitrogen in compost. It depends on the type of input feedstocks, of course. But anyway, what's most important is then making the calculation considering the nutrient content of compost in terms of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, the unit energy uptake and the emissions from production of mineral fertilizers, which is what we replaced by means of compost. And therefore, this leads us to calculating the total amount of saved greenhouse gases. And as you can see, the magnitude is between 20 and 30 kilograms equivalent overall of carbon dioxide per each ton of biowaste sent for composting, which is important, interesting, but not crucial. It's still relatively marginal to the overall challenge of fighting climate change. Let's consider nitrous oxide. What's the rationale of considering nitrous oxide? When we use a fast-release source of nitrogen, such as a mineral nitrogen fertilizer, we will have a high pool of nitrogen inside the soil, and a certain part of that may be turned into nitrous oxide, depending on kinetics, the soil condition, water, aerobic or anaerobic conditions inside the soil, and so on and so forth. Well, if we manage to reduce, even by a marginal value, the total amount of nitrous oxide which is produced and released by the normal mineral fertilizers, and basically we may do that using a slow release source of nitrogen, such as compost is. In compost, we don't have a release all at once of nitrogen. We have got a pattern of release which goes on slowly during the growing season. And therefore, we will have the crop, the root, ready to take up the nitrogen as soon as it is available, it is made available in the soil. So it's very likely to cause a total reduction of release of nitrous oxide into the atmosphere. Well, you can see basically the numbers in terms of kilograms or grams are very marginal, but then they have to be multiplied times 310, which is the global warming factor of nitrous oxide. Since nitrous oxide, as I already told you, is one of the most powerful greenhouse gases. So it is important, and better knowledge on this should be considered. Let's go to carbon sequestration. This is a quite easy calculation. Many of you know me, and I take it with me in many presentations on different aspects of biowaste management because it's pivotal. It's one of the key issues pertaining to the importance of biowaste management. This is a calculation related to a situation I know quite well, Italy. And you can see that if you consider the arable land area and the total amount of greenhouse gases produced in 1 year by all the activities using fossil fuels, well, you can have an easy calculation and come up with the final number, which is 0.25%, which is the percentage of carbon which, once you lock it up in the soil, will outweigh the total amount of greenhouse gases released from the country in 1 year. Which means, if we increase the total percentage of organic matter by that number, it's like storing 1 whole year of greenhouse gases inside the soil. Try to consider that in many plots, in many farmlands, in the northern flatlands, in Pianura Padana, have fallen from 3% organic matter to 1% or slightly more in last decades. How many additional years of greenhouse gases we transferred from the soil into the atmosphere? This is quite impressive. And we should bear it in mind while facing policy making related to biowaste management. Well, that was my calculation. This is the scientific evidence. Nature, one of the most credible, trustable scientific magazine, highlighting that in England and Wales, the carbon content of soils fell steadily in as little as 25 years, with some 13 million tons of carbon released, or better to be worded, transferred from the soil into the atmosphere, because they had just forgotten about organic fertilization. If we have got more organic matter inside the soil in the total balance of carbon, we will have more carbon in the soil to produce fertility and less carbon in the atmosphere to produce climate change. This is a model outline which we developed in a simplified way while working in 2001 for a survey on behalf of the European Commission. It was about options for the management of biodegradable waste. And we wanted to assess the externalities, beneficial or the negative externalities of managing biowaste in a certain way. Well, this wants to model more or less the agronomic pathways of organic matter once any soil improver is applied onto soils. But let me come to the chart which is plotted after this model. In this chart, you will have the organic matter depletion or organic matter build-up curves for different patterns of organic fertilization. With no ton given per year per hectare, with only 5 tons per year and hectare, with 10 tons per year and hectare, and with 15 tons per year and hectare. Of course, the more organic matter we use, the more there will be a tendency to increase the total level of organic matter inside the soil. Of course, the curves may be steeper or flatter depending on the cropping technique, the climatic conditions, the soil conditions, and so on. But it's a qualitative assessment I want to drive you to. Let's consider, by way of comparison, no organic matter given back to soils, hence we may consider all biowaste sent for landfilling or for incineration. And 10 tons per hectare and year, which is the normal load which is normally considered for organic fertilization. And let's make a comparison. You can see in first decades, there's going to be a remarkable decrease with no organic fertilization on soils in the level of organic matter in these plots. And if you make a comparison between no organic fertilization and 10 tons per hectare and year, the difference in as little as 100 years will be 3%. 3%, which means if we track it back to the 0.25 and something percent organic carbon, which is the quantity offsetting the total release of greenhouse gases from the country in 1 year, it's like losing or like storing in the soil 7 years of total greenhouse gas production. So it's a powerful tool in order to tackle the climate change issue. It's a powerful tool, and above all, as you may see, it's during the first decades where the effects are most important. So in next few decades, this might be a consistent tool in order to define policies to tackle climate change. This is also confirmed by scientific assessment. For instance, we have got a few long-term trials, experimental stations across Europe. This one is from the United Kingdom, Rothamsted, Her Majesty Experimental Station, you say. And you can see they started in 1893 with 2.38% carbon in soil, more or less 4% organic matter. And after cropping, after deforestation and cropping, with no organic fertilization, no soil improver, no compost, no whatever, they fell down to 0.89. Whereas with a steady addition of manure or compost, the manure of modern times, they kept it basically at the same level, which is important because we don't store more carbon, even in that situation, but we don't lose carbon from the soil. And it's important. This is why I tell our Swedish colleagues, because they say, oh, but we don't care about sequestering carbon in soils because we have got already plenty of carbon. That's the problem. You are the more prone to losing it into the atmosphere if you don't consider organic fertilization in your cropping techniques. Other benefits, okay, I already swiftly dwelt on that. This is suppression, so less energy required to produce pesticides, reduced soil erosion, lower loss of soils, therefore lower mineralization of organic matter. Again, it's a chain effect. This translates into less carbon translated into the atmosphere. Reduced irrigation thanks to the water holding capacity, and irrigating requires energy. It's important because we never have water where it is needed. And it will be more and more often like that because we are going to have concentrated climatic events and we need to store water somewhere and to take it elsewhere. Improve the soil structure and workability and so lower energetic input for cropping. But let's come to uncertainties because all the soil modelists, when they are challenged with the needs to try and model somehow the possibility to store carbon in soils through use of compost, they usually come up in the end with a statement like, we have got too many uncertainties, we can't do that. Well, I once asked my colleague, Pete Smith, probably one of the best soil modelists from the University of Edinburgh, but how big is the uncertainty? And he said, well, the uncertainty may be as big as, he gave me some numbers, and if you multiply it times the total arable land area across Europe, it gives you a total amount of carbon between the minimum and the maximum forecast, which is 5 times greater in itself than the total reduction target for greenhouse gases during the first commitment period under the Kyoto Protocols. Which means, if we look at it from another standpoint, despite uncertainties, the role of sequestration cannot be neglected in policy making. We have to keep it in mind, and we have to put it at the core of all strategies to manage biowaste. So what are the conclusions on life cycle analysis concerning compost, soils, and climate change? Most benefits are difficult to be quantified, but they are anyway important. The life cycle analysis are currently showing some limitations because methodology is not mature yet in that respect. And there is a certain discrepancy between accountability and efficacy of actions. Even if an action is not accountable for, nevertheless, it's effective. And so we should consider that. So waste policies, climate change policy, and inventories of carbon should recognize the role of soils and compost given to soils. Concerning the clean development mechanisms, which, as most of you may know, are the mechanism which is considered nowadays in order to have the carbon offsets in developing countries funded by the industrialized countries. Well, composting has been included in the clean development mechanisms as early as 2005. A standard calculation method has been defined. But once again, only the methane savings from landfills are accounted for. So they only consider the diversion of biowaste from landfills, which translates into less methane fugitive from landfills into the atmosphere. And still there are no credits for the soil-related benefits, which is unfair in the light of what I told you with the previous slides. But there are some signs of a future approach. If you don't know yet, but I think most of you do know it already, there are 10 Italian regions. Piedmont was one of the first ones alongside Emilia-Romagna, subsidizing farmers to use soil improvers, including compost, in order to promote a buildup of carbon in depleted soils. Not only for that, also to prevent eutrophication, in order to prevent erosion, in order to fight desertification, and so on and so forth. But also carbon sequestration is at the core of the rationale for the subsidy programs. And the unit subsidies are in the range of 200 to 700 euros. Well, actually, more than that, because in Val d'Aosta they go up to 840 euros per hectare. 840 euros per hectare, which is impressive. And this may really boost the compost use everywhere across Italy. Most of times, the farmers don't even know that. Let's go towards the end. Another sign of hope. After shouting up about the importance of organic matter in soils for years and years and years and years, the European Commission themselves have considered it in a very consistent, a very important report, the so-called Clean Soil Report, Soils and Climate Change. In the summary report, in the executive summary, it reads, the report underlines the need to sequester carbon in soils. The technique is A, cost competitive, B, immediately available, and requires C, no new or unproven technology, and there's a mitigation potential comparable to that of any other sector, industry, energy, transportation, and so on. So it's ready, the treasure is there. Let's go grab it. We have to do that. It's ready to be done. It's ready to be done. Okay, just to conclude with that, let me sum it up through a few numbers. I had already shown these numbers, but let me recap. You can see anaerobic digestion. Of course, I didn't dwell on that too much, but it's quite easy. You may have 200 up to 250 kilowatt hours per ton treated through anaerobic digestion, which at the current carbon intensity of energy production translates into 135, typical average number, carbon dioxide equivalents, kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents in terms of savings of greenhouse gases. Replacement of mineral fertilizers, it's a marginal value. More promising is the carbon sink, and then peat substitution, because peatlands are very far away. And yeah, harvesting them is not so energy intensive, but then transporting peat is very energy intensive because we are importing peat from Canada now. And so this is the unit savings related to substitution of peat by means of compost. So after all, the total savings are very important and may be in the range of 400 up to 500 kilograms equivalent of carbon dioxide per each ton of biowaste which is sent for composting and anaerobic digestion. This is a model district we modeled at the annual conference of the International Solid Waste Association. We were given this task to try and model. We considered a steady state condition with recycling, biological treatment, incineration, 60% recycling and composting. And as you can see, most of the savings come from recycling and biological treatment. It's basically around 16,000 tons in a district totaling 100,000 tons of waste, 16,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, total reduction out of a total of 17,000. So it's extremely important. And most of it comes, a little bit from replacement of mineral fertilizers, but by far most of that comes, once again, from the value of organic matter. There is no industrial system able to produce organic matter, only the photosynthetic process. And if we don't grab the organic matter before it decays in order to turn that into humus and give it back to soils, we will lose the potential of carbon sequestration, reduce greenhouse gases, and so on and so forth. But as you can see, once again, it's about 4/5 of the total energy savings coming from organic matter and not from replacement of mineral fertilizers. So the conclusions are carbon dioxide savings by anaerobic digestion are certain. It's quite easy to assess them, to account for them in eco-balances. The savings due to peat substitution by 1/3 of the compost, if you make the total typical average replacement factor, are much larger. Definitely, it's the most promising angle of the situation. The savings by nutrient substitution are certain. We know them, but they are rather marginal. And the benefits through physical effects on the soil, water retention, less erosion, improved workability are promising, but we still need a lot of research in order to integrate these aspects in life cycle analysis. But life cycle analysis have to be really comprehensive. They have to say, we must accept the challenge, we must take on this challenge, and we have to put better light on the soil-related benefits of using compost. Otherwise, they're not complete, and they are simply biased. If they don't consider the soil-related effects of using compost, just trace them. They are biased. Of course, trace them in the paper bin, not in the mixed garbage, of course. So you increase the separate collection rate of paper. Benefits of biological treatment are typically much larger than what may be accounted for nowadays. And let's keep in mind that organics are a big part of municipal solid waste, and optimizing management of organics with ready-to-implement strategies are a key driver for improvement in developing countries. This is not pertaining to Italy, hopefully. We are talking about developing countries, not developed countries. But anyway, at a worldwide level, this has to be a pivotal issue. This has to be put once again at the core of strategies for sustainability in farming, in cropping, in agricultural management. Thank you very much indeed. Keep in mind, the brand of ISVA, the International Solid Waste Association, is the daisy, you can see. So if you want to keep the daisy blooming, please give some organic matter back to the soil. Thank you very much indeed.